Everybody, welcome back to Connerty Meadows Farm. Today we are going to turn this raw milk into this delicious Fudgicles treat. All right, let's go over the things that we're going to need in this recipe. And the other thing is I'm going to tell you the alternative that you can use. Now, please understand, I have spent a lot of time making this recipe and spent many batches perfecting it. So if you choose to do it a little bit differently, it may not turn out exactly the same way. So for this recipe, we are going to be using raw milk from our cow. If you do not have raw milk, you can use a mixture of whole milk and whipping cream at equal parts. It's not going to be identical to how mine is going to work, but it will be fairly close. Now, the reason why you need to have the whipping cream is because of the extra fat content. Now, our cow, she gives us quite a bit of cream, so that's why we are saying you need whipping cream. The other thing we are going to need is some cornstarch. And the cornstarch is because we are using maple syrup. We need to be able to thicken this up. If you choose not to use maple syrup, you can use sugar in place of the maple syrup. But again, we're trying to use as many ingredients from our farm as we can. So we are using maple syrup because we make it here on our farm. Otherwise, you can use white sugar. I haven't tried it with honey, so I don't know how that would work. Feel free to experiment, obviously. We're gonna need a little bit of salt. We're gonna need some vanilla. You're gonna need a whisk. You're gonna need a pot for the stove. You're going to need powdered icing sugar. And you're going to need semi-sweet baking chocolate. Now, I have tried this recipe using semi-sweet chocolate chips. It does not work the same way. You'll still get a fudgicle, but it's more like a mushsicle. So this is the chocolate that I found works best. Alternatively, you can try it with cocoa powder. I just did not favor the flavor and the texture of it with the cocoa powder. I found it very grainy. So that's why I've switched to using the baker's cooking chocolate, and again, semi-sweet. The last thing that you're going to need is some kind of container that can handle heat and that pours. Because you are going to be pouring these into the last item that you need, your popsicle airy things. So you're gonna need this that'll handle heat with a spout to be able to pour into these. Don't worry, you're gonna be waiting for these to cool down before you put them in here, because you don't wanna melt these. All right, so let's get started with all the things that we need to do, and that means we're moving to the stove. The first thing that we're going to need to do is we are going to put 1/4 of a cup of milk, and again we're using our raw milk, into this pot. And this is just to get us started. We will be adding more. And we are going to add 6 tablespoons of cornstarch. You'll notice I'm not using measuring stuff. That doesn't have to be completely accurate. We're gonna go ahead and we're just gonna kind of get this mixed together. At this point, we have no heat. All the purpose of what we're doing right now is just to dissolve it and evenly distribute it through the whole pot in the milk. All right, we've got that all dissolved. Now we're gonna add just a smidge of heat to this. So I am on a propane stove. I'm gonna turn this down basically to just above the lowest setting it can go. And we're just gonna heat this up till it thickens a bit. We're going to go ahead and we're going to get our next cup of milk ready. And this is a very important step because as this thickens up, you need to be able to keep it from clumping together. Unfortunately, what happens is if you don't have this next step ready at the right moment, you'll get a big clump of goo. So make sure you've got your next cup ready to go of milk and have your milk set next to it because you will need that next bit of milk in a hurry. At this point, all of our clumps are looking like they're dissolved. I'm just making extra sure that there's none there, and then we are going to begin the process of slowly heating this up. You don't want to turn this on high. It's very important that this stays low, and just take your time. This isn't a process that can be rushed in any way. It seems kind of tedious to stand here and stir, but this is what you gotta do. I'm just going to speed this up for you guys so you don't have to sit and watch this the whole time. But in a second, I'm going to put it back to regular speed and show you where it is important that you're paying attention to get that next bit of milk in. Now right here, watch. Suddenly, it'll go from being thin to thick, and then you'll suddenly start seeing spaces at the bottom of the pan. Get your milk in now. So you're going to go ahead, you're going to put that other cup of milk in at this moment. And keep stirring. Once you get that all mixed together, you can go ahead and get your next cup of milk ready. Go ahead, stir with one hand, pour with the other. If you have a bigger measuring cup, of course, go ahead and get your 2 3/4 cups ready. The total amount of milk that you're going to be putting in this recipe is a total of 3 cups. So right now we have 2 1/4 cups in, and we're just slowly mixing it. We're going to go ahead, we're going to grab that last 3/4 of a cup and get it in. But before we do that, we are again just stirring and mixing. The reason why it's very important that you don't miss that special section of when it starts to clump is because if you miss it, you're going to end up with a very large clump of a mass of like a gelatin kind of thing. Now you can still continue and go ahead and make the recipe with it being chunky. It will just have a little bit of a weird chunky after flavor, after taste, after texture, and there's nothing wrong with it. So you can see I'm lifting up the whisk here and seeing there are some little bits on here, but nothing major. On the other hand, if I did not get the milk in time into the pot, this is actually what you'd end up with. Yeah, it's not so great, but just keep going. Doesn't have to get like that. If you can catch it before it gets hard like that, that's actually best, but it'll still work out even though it's hardened like that. Don't worry about it too much. So if this clump on a stick happens or clump on a whisk happens, you can actually continue to go ahead with the recipe like I'm going to show you here. But what you can do is you can add yourself a stick blender or an immersion blender and blend this all together once it's warmed up, and that will actually help in breaking up the chunks that are going to be in there. We can put that milk away. So now we've got this chunk here that we've got to deal with. So we're going to heat this back up and again put it fairly low, and then we're going to stir this all in until we can get it broken up. Again, if you can catch it before it gets to that stage, that's better. I was worried about my camera and I missed when it was just turning. The heat will cause it to break down again. So we're going to go ahead and we're going to stir this up, warm it all up, and then once it's warm, we'll add the next couple things. So if you want to break those chunks up faster, this is where you would use the immersion blender or stick blender to go ahead and blend it up. It does work, just keep in mind the milk is getting warm, so you don't want to burn yourself. Not so many chunks now, it's starting to break down. As the milk heats, it breaks down again. It's kind of like making milk gravy. Even though I could use a stick blender, I just went ahead and continued to use my whisk. So I was just testing the milk there. It's starting to warm up. So we want to add our next ingredient. The ingredient we're going to add is icing sugar. And we are going to add 1 cup of icing sugar. And what this does is it just helps thicken it up again as well without being too cornstarchy. If you put too much cornstarch in, it doesn't have a really good flavor. But the cornstarch isn't enough to just thicken it up with the 6 tablespoons. It helps, but it's not enough. So that's why we add the icing sugar. Now remember, we're keeping this on low. It's very important this is on low. You don't want to scorch your milk, okay? All right, and we are also going to add half a cup of maple syrup. And again, this is our maple syrup from our farm. If you don't want to use maple syrup, then you can use sugar. You can use half a cup of sugar. You would not need to add the icing sugar if you add the sugar. But I do, again, it doesn't set up right. It's a little bit more grainy. I'm not happy with the difference in using white sugar. You could try honey. Again, we have honey. I haven't tried it. I think I might give that a go. But for now, maple syrup is my tried and true, and it works great. Now this is going to darken it up a smidge because of the maple syrup. And remember, this is still on low. And we're just going to stir this. And you should feel that some of it might be trying to stick to the bottom, which is why it's super important to whisk this the whole time, not just a portion of the time. Now, if you are using raw milk and your cow does not have a good cream line, feel free to add some whipping cream in place of the whole milk. Just ensure that your total milk cream ratio is 3 cups. We are also going to add a pinch of salt. It just helps bring the flavor out a bit. And this is where we're going to add our chocolate. Now, we want to do this before this reaches the boiling stage. And you're going to take the chocolate bar and you're going to use half of it, which equals to 8 pieces, which is 2 ounces. If you look on the back of your thing, it says so 4 pieces equals 1 ounce. We're using 8 pieces, so we're using 2 ounces. Now we are going to mix this in. Now our vanilla here will wait until we pull it off the heat. And yes, just keep stirring, stirring, stirring. So now that our chocolate is melted, I am going to turn this up a tiny little bit, not much. And we are going to continue to stir this until it starts to boil. We do not stop stirring. Are you guys sick of watching me stir yet? I'm sorry, but I just want to show you seriously this whole process, and it really does involve a lot of stirring. But trust me, the end product is worth it. I've gone ahead and I've turned up the temperature a smidge. It's not as high as medium, it's not as low as low. I would say maybe about halfway between medium and low. Remember, it's very important that we don't stop stirring. Both the chocolate and the milk are prone to stick to the bottom of the pot. Don't forget to periodically scrape the edges of your pot down too. All right, you can see it's starting to boil and foam up. So I'm going to turn the heat way back down again. And we're going to stir pretty vigorously at this point, because we don't want it to boil over the top of the pot. And you can see it is starting to thicken up just a little bit. So we're down on the lowest setting again because we've brought it to a boil. And now what we're going to do is we are going to stir this at a boil for a minute or 2. We're waiting for it to get thicker. It's thickened up, but it's not as thick as I'd quite like to see it yet. we're looking for a bit of a pudding consistency. So right now we're at a thin pudding. We want to get just a smidge thicker. And surprise, there's more stirring. Seriously, an automatic stirrer would be cool. So we've lost our boil here, so I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to turn it up again just a smidge. You want to be stirring this at a boil for 1 to 2 minutes, and since I turned it down so low, since it was going so high, I lost the boil. So I just turned it up a tiny little bit. Let's get our boil back. If you want to use a bigger pot, so when it boils up, you have a little bit more room, you can do that. The only problem is in the beginning when you're adding the cornstarch, it makes it a little more difficult to stir. All right, we've got our boil back. So let's put a timer on for 2 minutes, but we are gonna keep an eye on it at that 1 minute mark to see if it's ready. While we are stirring here, let's talk a little bit about why we are stirring constantly. So one of the main reasons why you're stirring constantly is because milk scorches. That's another reason why we are also doing it on a low setting on our stove. Milk, and then you add chocolate and you add thickeners, are all a recipe for sticking to the bottom of the pan, which would not be a good thing. Sticking to the bottom of the pan also means that you run the risk of what's stuck to the bottom burning. If it sticks to the bottom and burns, that burning flavor is going to spread throughout your whole product, which doesn't really taste great. Nobody wants to eat burnt chocolate. So just make sure that you are watching carefully, stirring frequently. So you're just really going to make sure that when you're doing this, you have the time set aside for it. Once the initial part of stirring is over, it just sits for a little while, and then you're pouring it into your cups. So just make sure your kitchen's clear, you have time to focus on what you're doing, because if you put that stirrer down to go and deal with a child, an animal, or whatever, you do run that risk of burning it, scorching it, sticking it, all that fun stuff. So just make sure you're setting the time aside to do this. I know it seems like a lot, but in total, it should only take you 15-20 minutes. Okay, so just make sure that you can set the time aside. We are at the 1 minute mark, and what I'm looking for is for it to stick to my whisk, and it's not doing a super good job of sticking to my whisk yet. So let's go for that other minute. So don't forget to scrape off the edges. And if you're scraping off the edges and you're seeing that it's starting to thicken up on the edge of your whisk, you're getting pretty close. This is starting to get pretty thick now. When you scrape around the edge of your pot, you'll see that it's sticking to the edge of your thing, your whisk. You can see that it's coating my whisk now. So we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna pull this off the heat and let it cool down a little bit. Make sure you put a hot plate on your counter. Now you should, I don't know if the video will pick this up, you should be able to see this is thickening up. Now, unfortunately, once in a while you'll notice there are a few chunks of those corn starch in there that didn't fully melt. It'll just be a little bit gummy in your thing, which is why I do try, obviously, to make sure you add the extra milk before it hits that stage, but that can be pretty tricky. So now that it's boiled and it's off, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna add 2 teaspoons of vanilla extract. While this is still nice and warm. And yes, I know I'm not using actual measuring spoons. It doesn't really matter that much. I never ever have actually used proper measuring spoons to make this recipe. You can see that it's getting thicker now. So we are just gonna let this cool down just a little bit more, because if I tried to pour it in the glass right now, you do run the risk that the glass might shatter. I mean, this is cook-proof glass, but just to be on the safe side, I'm not gonna do it quite yet. We're just gonna leave it for probably a minute or two, and then we were going to transfer it into this container. Now I do like to periodically stir this so it doesn't form a skin on the top. If you've made cooked pudding before, you'll know that it will form a skin. So I'm just stirring to try to avoid that skin. It also does help it cool down just a bit.
So this particular batch was actually made with no name brand cornstarch.
You could always try to scoop those out if you want. I never bother. You could also pour it through like a sieve or something to scoop them out. Again, I never bother. Nobody in my family really cares. They're just happy to have the treat.
And this batch was made with name brand cornstarch. So I don't know if that contributed to the problem with the thickening and the chunks and whatnot, but going forward, I think I'm just going to stick with the name brand because it did seem to have a smoother product, as you can see here.
All right, so that is starting to thicken up a bit more. It's cooled off a little bit, so we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna pour it into.
And so yes, for this video, I actually did make 2 separate batches and conglomerated them together to give you a full video of the process.
All right. Now, this is gonna sit for a bit. You want this to cool enough that one, there's not a whole lot of steam coming off, and 2, you'll be able to touch the side of this without it hurting your hand. Because again, we don't want to melt these little guys that are made of a much thinner plastic. So this is what we're waiting on. Periodically stir this to avoid that skin. You should be able to see now, it's really thickening up in there. If I was making soap, I would say that this is that trace. I do make soap, but this is not soap, obviously.
So this was the name brand product and the one that I caught quickly at the beginning so it didn't have a chance to turn into a big chunk. And you can see it's much thicker, it's much smoother, it's just all around a better product, and the end product is better.
I can easily hold this in my hands now. So that means it's cooled off enough that we can go ahead and pour it into the molds. And you can see that it's thickened up enough that it's sticking to the mixer. So we are good. Well, let's go ahead and get it in.
So you can actually see during the pour here the little chunks in it, and again that was because it ended up not being caught quick enough and getting that second round of milk in. And so in the end you end up with still a product with some chunkies.
So you are going to notice that this does have a few little chunks in it, and that is the cornstarch that didn't mix properly. They will still turn out edible, don't worry. So you see those little chunks there? Once this is all frozen, you won't really notice it in the flavor and in the eating. Promise, I've done it before, many times. Clean off your edges. I'm sorry, I totally eat the edges, but anyway. Let's get our lids on. Ooh, it's gonna be close. Sorry, I'm gonna have to pour this last one from this side so I can see better what I'm doing. I don't want to overfill this. Ooh, we made it.
So take note here of how smooth and much more creamy this one is and this pour is. This was made with the name brand cornstarch, and it was also caught at the very beginning stages when I needed to get that milk in quickly. And you can see just by looking at the pour of the product of how much more smooth this product is going to be at the end. It actually ends up also being a little bit of a thicker product because the cornstarch is more evenly distributed and it's not just stuck in clumps. So those are some things to take into consideration when you're making this. I would probably use name brand going forward, like the one that I show you in the video, which for the first one that clumps up, I did not use. But you can see, like, look at how much more smooth that is. Now, those little pieces you're seeing are actually air bubbles. But you can also see not only is there not clumps in it, that it is just a thicker overall product. And I actually ended up, when we pull these out to eat them, there are some air bubbles in it. It was so thick, a lot like pudding. And if you were to snack on this, just without freezing it, it actually tastes an awful lot like pudding.
All right, guys, we're gonna go ahead and we're gonna put these in the deep freeze for at least 24 hours. Make sure you're putting them somewhere where they can stay upright in the freezer.
To get your fudgicles out of the mold, you simply need to run them under hot water. And you'll be able to see here in a second, do you see that little white dot? This was the batch that we made with the no name brand cornstarch, and it clumped up in a hurry. So you can see, just looking through the mold, that there is definitely chunkies in it. It's still going to taste good though, don't worry. And just very gently wiggle it there until it slides free for you. And you can see the white chunk. And there's another one. Everyone's getting some.
I might have melted it a smidge too much. Is there chunkies in it?
Yeah, you can see them on the top.
That's a big chunky.
That is fun though.
Yeah, you don't notice the difference. Is it goo or is it hard?
Half and half.
Is it yummy?
Tastes fine.
Is that a white chunk in it? Still tastes okay though, right?
Don't taste the difference.
No, exactly. So just because it gets a little bit chunky, it's still edible, right? Is it edible? All right, guys, it's a pretty hot day today. We've been moving fences. It's really hot out, so we're gonna go ahead. And I just pulled these out of the freezer. These are the fudgicles that we made. And these are the ones that aren't clumpy. The girls got into the clumpy ones already, and they still taste fine. So clumps are still fine. It's just a little bit of a texture weirdness. But we're gonna go ahead and we'll pull these out and we'll show you what they look like as well. Just go ahead and run it under hot water. Just enough to release it. Cap them in there.
And be careful during this part, because if you actually pull too hard before it's ready to release, you can pull the top off and you end up with the fudgicles still left behind in the mold.
And I overheated it. I totally overheated it when I was trying to melt it to get it out. But that's okay. So nice and creamy. And again, it's pretty warm out here today. Like 30 plus degrees Celsius, so we're pretty warm. So yeah, it's gonna melt quite a bit. And there's no chunkies in this one. So That's it, guys. That is how you make fudgicles that are absolutely delicious and made with raw cow's milk. All right, guys, thanks for hanging out with us on the farm, and we'll see you next time. It's melting!
Mush.
But is it good?
Yes, it kind of melted a lot.